Hey there, Epoxy here, joined by my two co-hosts Gonk and K-Dubs. Let's take a look at this recent Capcom Cup qualifier, CPT Canada-US West, between Snake Eyez and Reynald. To start off, we're going to take a look at some of the trends coming into the match from their fighter profile. K-Dubs, where's the breakdown of the super usage?
Okay, for super usage on each player's previous 100 matches, we're looking at Snake Eyez with primarily utilizing level 2 over level 3 and level 1. Um, some of that can be due to character specifics with how Zangief's level 1 is very contextually useful. Over to Reynolds, his super usage is much more even across the board, with a little bit more level 3 over level 2 and 1.
Yeah, so I think it's pretty easy to kind of infer from this Snake Eyez. We should really expect to see a lot of level 2, probably for crowd control. A lot of that is going to end up being what it is. I'm a little surprised to see level 1 usage as high as it is, even at just 14%. Kind of expected that to be a lot lower than even the level 3 super, which he doesn't even really touch. As for Reynolds, we were kind of expecting pretty split usage between the three, a little bit skewed toward level 3. I'm expecting to go for a little bit more chunk damage off the supers, but again, that could be a situational thing. Not really sure what to expect between these two, but ultimately, I think it's going to be pretty split between the three. But let's hear about Drive Rush, man. What do you got going?
So in Drive Rush, we're seeing some pretty interesting things here. In the Snake Eyez categories, we're looking at about 38% or so for the cancel Drive Rush, parry rush being about 6.5%, and quite differently, Reynolds sitting around 9% for the cancel Drive Rush, 6% for the parry Drive Rush. Pretty considerable difference there. I would expect in this matchup, we're going to see Snake Eyez really taking advantage of his Drive Rush. Makes a little bit of sense with Zangief, a grappling character, as a way to close down that distance. Reynald playing JP primarily. Probably we'll see a lot more crowd control happening, a lot more zoning going on with that character. So a Drive Rush in, a little less of a relevant thing, I would think, for his damage of that match. So should be a pretty interesting shakeup there. I'll be curious to see how much Snake Eyez is primarily using that rush over what Reynolds is doing. And then kind of kicking over to an interesting section. This is where we're going to wrap up a lot of the data that we see and just how different some of these numbers may be for professional players versus the rest of us commoners here. So kind of going over drive, parry, stuns, reversals, impacts. K-Dubs, any thoughts on that?
I think the big thing that sticks out is the lack of use of drive rush or drive reversal and drive impact. You don't see a lot of it, and you don't see a lot of stuns. But when they are used, they're probably going to be used effectively.
That is quite interesting, right? So for a stun, it kind of implies to us, if that being really low, that these players really good at controlling their burnout, right? You're not going to get stunned if you don't get burned out. You don't get burned out if you control your drive gauge really well, correct?
Yeah, and a lot of it comes down to space control and knowing how to control your space even when you are in burnout, just to make sure that you're not going to get, you know, drive impacted into the wall for that stun.
And Gonk, kind of take us into the last bit of this with the OD corner pressure that we're seeing from overdrive arts. What does that kind of tell you there?
Yeah, so we can expect, just looking at what we've seen from the past 100 matches, Reynolds especially, a lot of OD usage. That's primarily what he's using drive gauge on. Uh, More than likely a lot of zoning. I'm not a JP player by any means. I don't really know the character super in and out from a playing perspective. Um, but ultimately, I'm expecting to see a lot of zoning, a lot of space control, a lot of spikes, and that being the big primary use of his drive gauge. Uh, K Dubs, you got a little bit more expertise on JP. What can you tell me?
Yeah, we're going to most likely see a lot of that drive gauge used on OD um, portal traps and OD spikes, you know, trying to catch Snake Eyez moving in with that, big Zangief slow movement. Um, and you know, resetting, pushing him full screen, and making him start from from the full screen, and tagging him on any hit, sending him back.
All right, now let's take a look at the grand finals for the Canada US West qualifiers for Capcom Cup. We're going to start by taking a look at Drive Rush, specifically Cancel Drive Rush, and see how that influenced the match. So what we can see here is that Reynald landed 7 drive rushes in the first set of games. 22% of the total drive rushes that he threw out, 31, he landed. 22%, 7 drive rushes there. He had stuffed 2 of Zangief's drive rushes, that being 10% of the total amount of drive rushes that Zangief threw out, and he had blocked 6, or 31% of Zangief's total drive rushes. As mentioned, Reynald did throw out a total of 31 drive rushes in this first matchup. Conversely, Snake Eyez landed 11 drive rushes, 57% of his total amount of drive rushes that he threw out in these first set of games. He landed, his total being 19. He had stuffed 8 of the drive rushes that Reynald had thrown out, and he had blocked 16 of the drive rushes that Reynald had thrown out, that being 51% of the total amount of drive rushes that Reynald threw out were blocked by Snake Eyez. In the reset, we can see some interesting change to these numbers. JP lands 6, or 31% of his total. He does not stuff any of Zangief's, and he blocks 2 of them, or 25%. Throws out 19 of his own drive rushes in that game. Conversely, Snake Eyez lands 6, a lot less, of course. This was a short amount of games, but 75% of the total amount of drive rushes that he throws out in the reset. He lands, he stuffs 4, and blocks 9, 29% of the total amount of JP drive rushes he blocks. So throws out a total of 8, a lot less, but what we see from both sides here, an increase in the amount of lands in the reset. Okay, Dubs, what are we to take from this?
Well, looking at these numbers, you can see that Snake Eyez was utilizing Drive Rush for damage output a lot more successfully, landing those hits, getting damage, and also pretty successful on stuffing Reynolds' Drive Rushes. With 51%, 16 out of 31 drive rushes being on block, you can either see that Reynolds wasn't opening up Snake Eyez with the drive rush, maybe utilizing it a bit more to try and get some block pressure going, catching him with frame traps, just overall offensive pressure. You'll see that a bit more when we're looking at the counter hit stats later on.
Yeah, K-Dubs, to your point, Snake Eyes, his drive rush game is extremely optimal. Stuff rate is super solid. It seems like his guesswork is just a little bit more accurate. He can tell when he's gained his turn back. Reynolds, on the other hand, doesn't really seem to notice this as much. Honestly, could probably consider himself a little bit lucky that he doesn't get stuffed more. It seems like he's kind of consistently throwing out drive rushes and gets punished for it quite a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And K-Dubs, as we kind of talked about in the first session, reset was quite a bit different, wasn't it?
Looking at these numbers for drive rush usage in the reset, we can see that though the number of drive rushes is down, the reset was shorter than the first set in the grand finals. Ultimately, having the amount of drive rush per a round be higher, and showing that it's a much more aggressive game. And this is where patience can kind of come into play, being the the legacy Zangief player that Snake Eyez is, used to that very patient gameplay of trying to get in and holding mix-ups. You can see that Snake Eyes' use of drive gauge being used on block being much higher for those projectiles and holding that JP aggression. It's about 28% of that drive gauge being used on blocked damage.
Awesome. Well, leading into the next stage here, we're going to go into the Super Art gauge and what we saw there. Some interesting stats here with Snake Eyez seeing 1 level 1 usage there in the first set of games of the grand finals. 3 level 2s, no level 0s in the reset. Exactly the same for the most part. No level 1, no level 3, and then 3 level 2s. A very much dominant level 2 game there. Reynolds quite different here, more all over the place. First set of games of the grand final, 2 level 1s, 0 level 2s, 2 level 3s, and in the reset, the exact opposite ratio of super usage there at a 0 level 1, 2 level 2s, 0 level 3s. Kicking it off over to you first, Gong. What were you seeing there in the Snake Eyez play?
Yeah, so the level 1 from Snake Eyez definitely looks unintentional. It's a whiff. Kind of to me looks like just kind of incorrect inputs, not really what he was expecting to do. Uh, don't really have a whole lot of insight on that one. Level 2 supers, though, we could see that he used that as a punish counter against Reynolds 4 times throughout these matches. A lot of times he's using this to control neutral, especially when Reynolds got the spike sandwich going against JP's counter grab while he has advantage. Also utilizes the immunity to projectiles during that. Level 3, again, he's not touching this. This isn't something that he's really using at all. 6% in the last 100 matches played. We don't see it appear whatsoever in this entire matchup, so nothing to really speak of there.
So with Reynolds super usage, a bit different than Snake Eyez. It's more even across the board between 1, 2, and 3. And in the first set, with 2 level 1s and 2 level 3s. The 3 most likely being used for damage and finishing rounds. Level 1, you get that damage, but the big thing is they get sent full screen, so you can get right back to that zoning game. In the reset, we see all the super usage being used for level 2. You can make a safe assumption that this is being used for pressure. He's really trying to get something going. The reset did not go as well as the first set for Reynolds, and he was really throwing everything at the wall, trying to get some sort of opening, get some pressure going. So a lot less commanding. Great when you can get that level 2 to get the reset and open it up for another combo, but when it doesn't happen, you don't get anything out of it. And we saw Snake Eyez find a easy out each time. So
Yeah, what's really interesting to look at with these Reynolds numbers comparing to the previous 100, quite a bit different stats. You know, in the previous 100, we see 53% usage for the level 3, 23% for level 2 and level 1. And then in the games themselves that they were playing, 33% across the board. So quite a bit different, almost maybe more reactive gameplay, maybe just kind of getting lost in terms of what the game plan was. For the matchups, just really not being used to Snake Eyez and his patience with the Zangief matchup. So yeah, it just was really interesting to see Reynolds' numbers quite considerably change comparative to their match history, whereas Snake Eyez' numbers stayed really consistent to his match history as well.
All right, let's get into counter hit and punish counters. A pretty massive disparity in some of these stats. For the main game, counter hits between the two players are pretty similar, though. A lot of training going on in these matches. Poxy, what's going on?
What I'm finding pretty interesting here is the punish counters stat. You got 9 for Reynolds, 20 for Snake Eyez. Counter hit is pretty similar, as you mentioned, 23 for Reynolds, 25 for Snake Eyez. So just keep in mind with what a counter hit is on the startup frames of an attack. If you throw an attack out first and interrupt that is what your counter hit. A punish counter is in the recovery frames for an attack. If you hit the person while they're in their recovery frames, that's a punish counter. To me, what that implies, both players being pros are really good in terms of their anticipation of when an attack is going to come out. They're both seeming to have a pretty solid read of that at least in the first grouping of games that they played against each other, knowing that somebody is going to throw an attack and then beating that, having a good idea of what attack beats what as well. Season's pretty strong there. What's particularly interesting is the amount of punish counter difference there. So for me, Snake Eyes having a very good read of that neutral game to either cause whiffs to happen for Reynald or blocking attacks, and really knowing the heavy attacks or the things that there's going to be a longer recovery on that Snake Eyes can do a punish counter on. So it's a really good understanding of that game. I did find in watching this match that a punish counter tended, not all the time, but tended to lean to more damage opportunities. Counter hits most of the time or often don't lead into a damage opportunity. People can generally have a decent block after getting countered hit, or there's a distance space that is created there. So that doesn't always equal big damage opportunities. Punish counters more so, knockdowns and all that stuff happening there. So there was a really good amount of damage put in from that perspective. What's really particularly interesting is once we get to the reset. Now, again, keeping in mind, as we talked about in other sections, that the reset was 6 rounds versus the 11 of the main grouping of games, the first grouping of games that they played. It is wild that the amount of counter hits that Snake Eyes has increases to 26 versus the 7 that Reynald has. And then what we see on the reset for Snake Eyes is 14 punish counters, 7 punish counters for Reynald. A really great return rate on that, also considering that there was such a significant less amount of rounds played in this reset. So that return was fantastic on that. Kind of to what we have shown before, that this game, the reset was getting a lot more aggressive, a little bit more sloppy. And Snake Eyes, being such a patient player, had a good reading of these attacks that were being thrown at him. That patience, I think, really coming in handy, especially in the fact that he could do so many counter hits. Counter hit may not lead you to a ton of damage opportunities, but they do add up. If you're getting 26 counter hits in 6 rounds, that adds up to a decent amount of damage, even if it's just a single hit that comes from it. So really great there. We can also see an interesting graph here that we made in the momentum graph. Now what this is how many seconds it took for a player to win the rounds that they won. What we can see is overall pretty back and forth in the first set of games that they played in the grand final. Both players were going back and forth. There was a really decent distribution of that momentum. But towards the end of the grand finals and then into the reset, we can watch the momentum drastically swing into Snake Eyes' favor. So, and then the average of the minutes or the seconds to win a game leaning into Snake Eyes' favor really just shows quite the domination that was happening, especially in the reset part of this game, as we have talked about with a lot of these stats. Awesome. Now to take us out here, boys, any final thoughts here on the matches that we saw?
Yeah, I think one of the big takeaways that I could really put down is that early on, I mean, it's pretty easy to just say, especially looking at kind of the second half of the data that we've taken, that this is pretty dominant from Snake Eyes. But really, in the early matches, this is a lot closer than what stats really show it as. It really took until probably about, I'd say like match 5, round 2, maybe into match 6, where you could really see specifically where Reynolds' mental starts to slip. Before that, though, super close to winning. A lot of really early wins that were fantastic on his end. Really, just after that, mental slips. He gets aggressive way too easily.
And something that needs to be pointed out here is that there was a lot of really good adaptation from Snake Eyes. Something that stats won't show is how players played in the neutral and how they reacted to each other. And in the first set, it was going back and forth and trading, punish counters on whiffed moves, and there was just a lot of cleanup by Snake Eyes, and Reynolds couldn't really get anything started.
All right, thank you for stopping by Framed by Data for this analysis here of the matchup between Snake Eyez and Reynald for the CPT Canada US West finals here. It's going to be awesome to see Snake Eyez go into the Capcom Cup this year. I'm really excited to see a Zangief there. I think most of us are. Stay tuned to the channel. We'll be doing more of these match analysis going forward. Lots of data, lots of stats. See you soon.